The natural world is a place of varied forms and hues. Some species are rather horrific to look at, while others can be quite aesthetically pleasing. This is true of plants and fungi as well as animals. Most people can appreciate the beauty of a colorful flower or the majesty of an elk in a forest glade. There is another sort of aesthetic, though, that is perhaps a little rarer, but by no means unheard of. Sometimes there are species that are simply cute or adorable. An obvious example for most would probably be cats, and kittens in particular. Such creatures with large, plaintive eyes and soft fur tend to evoke a quite distinctive reaction in many people. And yet, anybody who has ever kept a house cat knows there are claws and fangs behind this apparent cuteness. One tends to regard kittens a little differently after having half a dozen of the little imps trying to claw their way up one's legs at feeding time. There are other creatures to be found in the wild that also seem quite innocuous at first. It would be difficult to envision a creature more apparently harmless than a caterpillar, at least unless you are watching a few 100,000 of the little creatures devouring a crop field. Voracious appetites aside, an individual caterpillar may seem almost endearing in an alien sort of way. The fuzzy caterpillars in particular might easily verge upon the adorable in some people's eyes. This sentiment does have a certain sense behind it. Between the soft body, the rounded contours, the often bright colors, and the apparent softness of a coat of hairs, many caterpillar species are easy to regard as cute. Of course, in nature, things are not always as they seem. There are certain types of caterpillar that can cause irritation, searing pain, debilitating nausea, or even death, with little more than a gentle touch. It is ironic that the fuzzy caterpillars in particular are often the most dangerous in this regard. The whole concept of cuteness would require a deep look into human psychology to properly address. Here we can probably say this much at least. This particular aesthetic tends to be associated with rounded body shapes, apparent softness, and relatively large eyes. One might regard such traits as neotenic or childlike. Of course, details are somewhat more subtle and complicated, but overall, such patterns are easy enough to recognize upon sight. It is worth noting that appearances within the natural world arise from whatever functions best in a given environment, rather than what pleases the human eye in particular. As such, cuteness in nature is often incidental, and admittedly rather subjective even to begin with. I recall speaking with a particularly enthusiastic entomologist who maintained that maggots were cute in their way. Apparently, there was something about the way they wriggled across a surface that he found most endearing. In any case, there are a few features that tend to be more generally appealing to people. Bright colors, for example. Granted, such hues are sometimes used as advertisements in flowers trying to attract pollinators, or in many bird species where the males are attempting to attract mates. In other circumstances, bright colors are often indicators of toxicity and potential danger, a warning label of sorts. As for fuzziness, for a great many mammals, this is simply a convenient form of insulation. Many birds might puff up their feathers to aid them in thermoregulation, or perhaps even as a form of intimidation for rivals. The fact that this tends to make them all rounded and fluffy is merely incidental to the actual purpose. In the case of caterpillars, a dense covering of hairs is generally a form of defense. Thermoregulation isn't so likely, given the small size of such creatures. That and the fact that they are ectothermic. After all, spending energy to generate body heat would be rather wasteful in a creature trying to rapidly gain body mass to reach maturity. In some species, the defensive hairs and bristles include various forms of poison. Even if such hairs are not envenomed, they can be quite irritating to anything that might try to eat the caterpillar. Granted, there are ways around such defenses, as is always the case in nature, but even if such adornments discourage only a portion of potential predators, they are apparently worth having. Even without any poison, certain types of caterpillar hairs can be quite irritating to the skin of sensitive individuals. Whether venomous or not, such defensive hairs are also known as urticating hairs. They are so named because they are capable of inducing urticaria in the skin, also known as hives. I should mention that urtica is the Latin term for nettles, and this is actually quite appropriate. The minuscule stinging hairs found on nettles are structurally quite similar to some of the stinging hairs on caterpillars, an intriguing case of convergent evolution. There are roughly 180,000 known species of butterflies and moths. Thus, it should be no surprise that even the subset of species with fuzzy caterpillars encompasses a wide variety of forms. By some classification schemes, there are nearly a dozen distinct sorts of defensive hairs found among the various caterpillar species. This can be somewhat confusing, though, as tarantulas also have urticating hairs, and there are generally 7 recognized varieties among the different species of these rather hirsute arachnids. So perhaps for the sake of clarity and specificity, another useful term to know might be erusism, also known as caterpillar dermatitis. This term encompasses the typical irritation and inflammation resulting from caterpillar envenomation. Incidentally, the word eruca is Latin for caterpillar, and an eruciform larva is an insect larva that resembles a caterpillar in overall appearance. To come back to the urticating hairs of caterpillars in particular, the various types may be broadly sorted into 2 groups. There are the spicule hairs that freely detach, and the spine hairs that remain attached to the caterpillar, though some types often have their tips break off in the course of envenomation. Detached spicule hairs may accumulate in an environment with high populations of the wrong sorts of caterpillars or moths, acting as irritants to anyone who happens to pick them up on their skin. Worse still, such hairs may even become airborne in some cases, causing considerable discomfort if they happen to get into a person's eyes or upper respiratory system. Despite these issues, the spine hairs are probably the more formidable weapons overall. Spicule hairs tend to mainly cause irritation. In some species, spine hairs can cause significant pain and even endanger a person's life. To begin with, though, let us consider a variety of fuzzy caterpillar that is one of the least dangerous. Pararctia isabella is an arctiid moth with caterpillars commonly known as woolly bears. These little caterpillars have a red midsection with a black front and back. More precisely, this coloration is found in the urticating hairs. The woolly bears are densely covered with what might be classified as type 8 urticating hairs as far as Lepidoptera are concerned. These hairs contain no poison whatsoever, and these fuzzy little black and red creatures are generally safe to handle. However, even these hairs can be quite irritating to sensitive individuals. To make things more complicated, there is another species with caterpillars that look quite similar to the woolly bears. This species is Lophocampa maculata, also known as the yellow-spotted tussock moth. It has densely fuzzy caterpillars with a yellow or orange band in the middle, and black at each end. There also tend to be a few wisps of long white hairs peeking out of the dense black hairs on the front and back of the body. In this species, the hairs are likely to be type 9. In other words, each hair is associated with a simple poison-secreting cell at its base. Several other tussock moth species in the family Erebidae also have similarly venomous hairs. One common trend is seen in both the Lasiocampidae and the Thometopoidae. These 2 families include New World tent caterpillars in the former case, and Old World processionary caterpillars in the latter. Both of these groups tend to be quite gregarious, with larvae gathering together into large groups. If they did not possess their various sorts of defensive urticating hairs, they would be an easy buffet for would-be predators. As it is, they are more like a plague than anything else. Some tent caterpillar species tend to have population booms roughly every decade or so. It can be quite unnerving to see every single tree in an area bearing multiple silken structures in its branches, which are the improvised communal homes of the tent caterpillars. It can be still more unsettling to see these same trees effectively stripped of all their foliage by midsummer. Even so, the urticating hairs in these groups, as well as several other Lepidopterous species, are little more than mild irritants. However, there are 3 particular families that contain species with especially troublesome urticating hairs. These are the Limacodidae, the Megalopygidae, and the Saturniidae. The Limacodidae are sometimes known as cup moths or slug moths. The latter name is based upon the often slug-like appearance of their caterpillars. The heads of these caterpillars tend to be tucked away beneath the front of their bodies, further enhancing this odd appearance. The urticating species in this family tend to have type 11 spine hairs, which are relatively complex structures that include poison glands and associated neurons. Some species also have type 5 detachable spicule hairs, sometimes known as caltrop spines. These are small, rhomboid structures with several spikes that bear a passing resemblance to caltrops. Apart from their urticating hairs, there is something of a peculiarity among all of the slug caterpillars, which requires a bit of explanation. In most caterpillars, there are 6 short legs at the front, which develop eventually into adult legs, and 10 soft prolegs on the abdomen. These prolegs are hydraulically driven and typically have arrays of hooks on their undersides for gripping whatever surface the caterpillar is walking across. Unlike the front legs, the prolegs are lost in metamorphosis. In the Limacodidae, the prolegs are reduced to simple suckers on the underside of the body. As such, these caterpillars don't so much walk across surfaces as creep across them, much like slugs, one might say. In fact, the Latin word for slug is limax, which is the basis of the family name Limacodidae. While a great many slug caterpillars are relatively smooth and harmless, there are quite a few species that have formidable urticating hairs. Perhaps the least troublesome of these is the hag moth, Phobetron pithecium, sometimes also known as the monkey slug. These brown caterpillars have several long, thin tubercles extending from their bodies on either side. These tubercles are densely covered with fine irritant hairs, along with most of the caterpillar in general. Only the underside is hairless. Each of these tubercles can break off without causing much trouble for the caterpillar, and this happens often enough that these creatures often look rather ragged and unkempt. A somewhat more aggressively defended species is the spiny oak slug, Euclea delphinii. These caterpillars tend to be mainly green with various spots of other colors. Like the hag moth, they have several tubercles along the sides of their bodies, and several more down the back. Unlike the hag moth, these tubercles are sturdier and arrayed with properly venomous type 11 spines. A similar pattern is seen in the stinging rose moth, Parasa indetermina. These caterpillars have a wide variation of color, ranging through hues of green, yellow, orange, and red, depending upon the individual. They also have fairly ornate patterning, making them quite pretty by some standards. However, this is one form of beauty that is best admired from a distance. Another species of notably venomous limacodid is the saddleback caterpillar, Acaria stimulea. These caterpillars get their name from a brown oval spot in the middle of their back, which is reminiscent of a saddle. While the middle of the caterpillar is relatively smooth, there are spiny tubercles at either end and all around the sides. The overall coloration is quite distinctive, with a bright green band across the midsection, in contrast to dark brown hues at either end, as well as the dark brown saddle spot. An especially interesting limacodid species is the mottled cup moth, Doratifera vulnerans, found in Australia. The little caterpillars in this species have a coloration somewhat similar to that of the saddleback caterpillar, with a green midsection, though the brown patches at either end may be more red or orange or even a pale beige depending upon the individual. Regardless of coloration, there are two main types of tubercles extending from these particular caterpillars. There is a row of slender tubercles down either side of their bodies, as well as a pair or two at the front and back of the body. Their backs are adorned with two quartets of stout, rounded, defensive tubercles, one quartet at each end of the body. Normally, when the caterpillar is at rest, these defensive structures are somewhat sunken in, and the spines are all bundled together tightly, side by side, laying flat and pointing towards the middle of the body. When the caterpillar is perturbed, muscles in the body wall increase the fluid pressure inside of these tubercles and they inflate. As they do so, the spines are raised up and spread out until each of these structures resembles a tiny pincushion. As unpleasant and painful as the urticating lamicodid caterpillars can be, the larvae in the family Megalopygidae are often far worse. They are also a good deal more fuzzy, to the point that they appear quite soft and harmless. The most notable species in this family is the southern flannel moth, Megalopygidae opercularis. Other common names include the puss caterpillar, the woolly slug, the fire caterpillar, and the asp caterpillar. Such nomenclature should give some idea of the creature's appearance, as well as the severity of its stings. To say that these caterpillars are hairy would be something of an understatement. There are pampered Persian cats that are less fluffy than these little monsters. Indeed, an excess of fluffy hairs seems to be the lifelong destiny of this particular species. When the eggs are laid on a plant, they are coated in a layer of fuzz from their mother's underside. When the first tiny caterpillars hatch out, they are adorned with thin wisps of long, slender hairs as well as shorter, venomous spines. These creatures can sting from the moment they hatch. When they pupate, they shed their coating of fine, non-venomous hairs to incorporate into the cocoon as they spin it around themselves. The adults that emerge from the pupae are covered in dense, downy fuzz, patterned with hues ranging from white through yellow and golden brown all the way to black. While these fine hairs may detach and cause minor irritation, the moths at least are not venomous. If anything, they look almost ridiculously cuddly. It is as if a moth was trying to become a plush toy. It may be worth noting that these moths are also rather stout with large fuzzy abdomens. In fact, the family name Megalopygidae roughly translates into large backside. Make of that what you will. To return to the caterpillars, they are adorned with two major types of hairs. The most prominent and noticeable are the long, slender hairs that exist in profuse densities in later larval instars. This thick coat of fur obscures the short, stout, venomous spines. Both of these hair types arise from 3 rows of raised bumps on either side of the caterpillar's body. There are 2 rows down the back and 2 rows down each side. This pattern is also seen in the related species Norape ovina, the white flannel moth. The caterpillars in this case lack the dense covering of fine hairs seen in their cousins, so the warty bumps bearing the spines and wisps of fine hair are clearly visible. In fact, they are highlighted by the distinctive coloration of these caterpillars. They tend to be red at each end and black in the middle, while the raised spots with urticating hairs are pale yellow. This makes them stand out quite sharply. To return to the southern flannel moth, it is difficult to overstate the severity of the sting in these caterpillars. It has been compared to the pain associated with a broken bone or other blunt force trauma. Symptoms include a sharp burning sensation, localized swelling, nausea, and headaches. The resulting rash may include blisters, and it is not unusual for the welts to ooze to some degree. More severe cases may include abdominal distress, chest pain, numbness, and difficulty breathing. Recent research into the venom of these caterpillars has uncovered a few unexpected features. One is a similarity of the proteins to certain bacterial toxins known as aerolysins. It seems probable that the caterpillars obtained their uniquely painful toxins via horizontal gene transfer from bacteria. Incidentally, the venom mechanism is also similar to that seen in box jellyfish as well as certain centipedes, both of which are also quite notorious for the severity of their toxins. Apparently, the venom of flannel moth caterpillars includes protein complexes known as megalysins that insinuate themselves into cell membranes and open large pores in them. This is generally very bad for the cell. The venom also activates pain receptors to an incredible degree. As horrific as all of this might be, these densely fuzzy caterpillars are not the worst of the urticating sort. That dubious honor goes to a species within the family Saturniidae. Several Saturniid caterpillars have urticating hairs which tend to have a fairly distinctive overall pattern. These hairs usually take the form of distinct spines clustered on roughly conical little tubercles. At a glance, they look almost like minuscule pine trees. The caterpillars tend to have several rows of these structures, giving an impression vaguely reminiscent of a shambling bit of miniature forest. In North America, two species in this family are especially noted for their painful stings. These are the Io moth, Automeris io, and the buck moth, Hemiluca maya. However, these creatures are little more than minor inconveniences compared to a more southerly Saturniid species. Lonomia obliqua is found in South America and Brazil in particular. It is a fairly drab caterpillar, tending to favor shades of mottled gray and brown. The overall form is similar to that of the buck moth caterpillar, but this creature is considerably more dangerous. The venom in this species interferes with blood clotting processes and alters the permeability of blood vessels. A sufficient dose results in a sort of hemorrhagic syndrome with large-scale internal bleeding. Basically, imagine the entire body developing multiple bruises throughout the internal organs, and you have the beginning of some idea of what this might be like. As if this isn't bad enough, such uncontrolled internal bleeding becomes especially dangerous in the brain case. As blood enters this rigid cavity within the skull, it increases the internal pressure until the brain is essentially crushed to death. The body dies immediately thereafter, of course. One small positive aspect to this unpleasant situation: it generally takes a fairly large dose of venom for such a lethal scenario to unfold. Thus, the slightest touch from one of these caterpillars will certainly ruin your day, but it may not be altogether lethal. Alas, these caterpillars often cluster together in the wild. Overall, this species is considered by many to be the single most dangerous type of caterpillar on Earth. To conclude matters for today, there is a great variety of caterpillars wandering the Earth. Quite a number of varieties can be quite pleasant to look at. Some species are beautiful, and others may even be regarded as adorable. However, such impressions may often belie a lurking danger. A casual touch from the wrong caterpillar may result in severe skin irritation or agonizing pain or debilitating conditions. Even an untimely demise is not altogether out of the question. Thus, if you should happen across a caterpillar that is especially fuzzy or brightly colored, it may perhaps be best to admire the little creature from a safe distance. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have enjoyed today's little foray into the unknown. If you are still curious and wish to venture a little further, here are a few things you might consider looking into. If you found this video enjoyable, do feel free to leave a like. If you believe others might enjoy it, by all means, share. If you wish to see more of this channel, a subscription should prove quite helpful. Until next time.